Lieutenant Mercer grabbed the rope himself. He yanked the canvas off before the ceremony even started, before the commander gave the signal, before the families were ready, before anyone could prepare. Then he laughed, loud, deliberate, performed for his audience. He turned to the crowd, pointed directly at the pink aircraft and said, "Somebody actually put this on a military memorial who signed off on that insult. That's not a tribute. That's a disgrace to every pilot who ever served." I was still laughing when the first soldier stepped forward. Then another. Then another. Until 23 men were standing between him and that aircraft, and none of them were laughing. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning air at Red Canyon Air Force Base was the kind of sharp and clean that only the Arizona desert could produce in late October. Not that Emily Hayes was thinking about the air. She hadn't thought about things like that in a long time. When you spend 3 years learning how to walk again, learning how to sleep through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, learning how to sit in a room full of people who look at your cane before they look at your eyes, you stop noticing the kind of things you used to love. You stop noticing the sunrise. You stop noticing the smell of jet fuel. You stop noticing almost everything that used to make you feel alive. She stood at the edge of the crowd gathered along the main runway, keeping her distance the way she always did now. Her left hand rested on the handle of her cane. Her uniform was pressed sharp because that was the one habit she had never been able to break even after the discharge papers came through, and the Air Force became something she used to belong to instead of something she still was. She wore her service dress because somebody had asked her to. She wore her ribbons because it would have been strange not to. She stood straight because she was stubborn, and because the physical therapist had told her that posture was one of the few things still completely within her control. The ceremony was supposed to start at 1000 hours. It was 9:47. She was already counting down the minutes until she could leave. There must have been 200 people on that runway. Base personnel, a handful of local civilians, veterans from several different units, families of soldiers, a few local journalists with cameras and press credentials hanging around their necks like they had somewhere important to be. And then there were the pilots. A cluster of them stood near the front, younger than Emily, by at least a decade, wearing flight suits that still had that new quality to them, the kind of confidence that comes from talent and training and not yet having faced something that breaks you. Emily had been one of them once. She had been better than most of them, actually. She just never said that out loud. The centerpiece of the ceremony was covered with a giant canvas tarp anchored by ropes along the edges. Whatever was underneath had been positioned at the end of the runway, nearest the visitors area facing south angled, so that when the cover came off, the gathered crowd would get the full view all at once. Emily had been told it was a retired A-10 Thunderbolt II, the aircraft that her generation of Air Force pilots simply called the Warthog. She had not been told anything else about its appearance. She figured it would be gray. Maybe dark gray, the standard combat finish. Maybe repainted in something clean and ceremonial. She had not been expecting what was actually underneath. When the base commander gave the signal and 3 airmen pulled the ropes and the giant canvas dropped to the asphalt in a single rushing slide of fabric, the crowd reacted instantly. There was a gasp, a collective inhale that swept through 200 people in the span of a single second, and then came the laughter. Not from everyone, not even from most people. But from the cluster of young fighter pilots near the front, it came hard and fast and loud. The kind of laughter that fills a space and demands attention. The Warthog had been painted pink, not a subtle rose color, not a dignified crimson, not a tasteful nod to something feminine or historic. It was bright, unmistakable, almost aggressive in its pinkness, the wide, flat nose of the A-10 painted in a neon shade that caught the Arizona sunlight and practically glowed. And on the side of the nose, just forward of the cockpit, someone had painted the same cartoon that Emily had authorized on her own aircraft 3 years ago as a joke between her and her crew chief. A fat little cartoon warthog with enormous tusks and tiny stubby wings and an expression of absolute ridiculous determination outlined in white against the pink background. Emily stared at it. She felt something shift in her chest, not pain exactly, something older and more complicated than pain. "Is this a joke?" one of the young pilots said, not quietly, to the man standing next to him. His voice carried the way voices do when the speaker doesn't particularly care who hears them. Who approved that paint job? That thing looks like a toy. It looks like something a kid painted, the second pilot said. He was grinning that easy grin of someone who finds something embarrassing and isn't invested enough in it to feel embarrassed himself. It doesn't belong on a military base, the first one continued. I'm serious, that looks like a daycare decoration. The third pilot, the one Emily would later learn, was named Lieutenant Aaron Mercer, 26 years old. F-35 qualified top marks across every performance. Evaluation stepped forward, half a pace from the group, and said it loud enough to carry. Who approved this embarrassment? That thing belongs in a daycare, not a military memorial. The laughter from his companions answered like a chorus. Emily's grip tightened on her cane. She did not move. She had become very good at not moving when the instinct said run or react or say something. 3 years of physical therapy and grief counseling had given her an almost mechanical ability to hold perfectly still while something inside her was screaming, because she recognized that aircraft. Not just because it was an A-10. She had flown dozens of A-10s. She could walk up to any one of them in the dark and tell you where every control surface was, where every panel opened, where the gaps in the armor plating were, and why they existed, and what a direct hit from a 14.5 millimeter round would actually do to the hydraulic lines running behind the left engine nacelle. She recognized it because it was hers, or it had been hers. The nose art, the paint, the specific ridiculous cartoon, that was the aircraft she had named Pink Warthog on a cold morning in a forward operating base in Afghanistan because her crew chief had bet her $20 that she wouldn't put a cartoon on a combat aircraft, and she had taken that bet without a second of hesitation. The aircraft she had flown into a storm that no sane pilot would have entered. The aircraft that had been destroyed. Her fault, her choice, her consequence, while she tried to pull soldiers off a mountain that was trying to kill them. And now it was here, repainted, restored, placed on a concrete pad with a brass plaque she hadn't been close enough to read. And people were laughing at it. The thing that struck her most, the thing she would think about later, much later, when she was trying to understand why that morning affected her so completely, was not the laughter itself. People laugh at things they don't understand. That's human. She knew that. She had accepted it in a vague, distant way. What struck her was the certainty in it. Lieutenant Mercer and his colleagues weren't questioning the aircraft. They weren't curious about its history. They weren't wondering why someone had painted it pink or what the story behind the nose art might be. They had looked at the surface, absorbed exactly what the surface showed them, and made a complete judgment, confident, public, and contemptuous, without one single moment of wondering what they might be missing. She had been that confident once. Before Afghanistan, before the valley, before the night she found out exactly what she was willing to do and exactly what it would cost her. She started to turn away from the runway. She had attended the ceremony. She had seen the aircraft. She had heard the laughter. She could leave now. She could drive back to the small house she was renting in Tucson and sit on her back porch and watch the sun move across the sky and try not to think about the fact that the thing she had loved most in her entire life was now a painted monument that strangers were mocking. She was 3 steps from the edge of the crowd when she heard the voice. It was not loud. That was the strange thing about it. In a crowd of 200 people on a runway where aircraft engines could drown out human speech at distances of 100 yards in a moment, where a cluster of young pilots were still chuckling among themselves, a single voice, measured and quiet and absolutely firm, somehow cut through all of it. You're making fun of that aircraft. Emily stopped. She turned. The man who had spoken was Army. She could tell from the uniform before she could read any of the insignia, the cut, the patches, the way he stood, which was different from the way Air Force personnel stood, lower center of gravity, a certain kind of solid stillness that came from years of carrying weight on ground that didn't always cooperate. He was maybe 32, 33 years old. His face was weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weather and stress and sustained exposure to things most people only saw in news coverage. The name tape on his chest said Brooks. He was looking directly at Lieutenant Mercer. Mercer blinked. Whatever he had expected from the moment, this wasn't it. He turned slightly toward the soldier, and his expression did a small, involuntary thing. Not quite a flinch, but a recalibration, a reassessment of the situation. "Sergeant," Mercer said with careful politeness. I know what you were doing," Brooks said. I was not angry. That was the thing about him that Emily noticed immediately. He was not performing outrage or staging a confrontation. He spoke the way people speak when they have already decided exactly what they need to say, and they are simply saying it. No wasted motion, no hesitation. You were laughing at that aircraft, Brooks said, and at whatever embarrassing story you assume comes with the paint. I mean, no disrespect to Pitum, then stop, Brooks said. The word landed like something physical. Mercer went quiet. Around them, a pocket of silence was forming, spreading outward from the confrontation. The way silence tends to spread when something real is happening and people can sense it. Brooks did not look away from Mercer. That aircraft, Brooks said, pulled my platoon out of a mountain valley in Afghanistan 3 years ago. We were surrounded. We had wounded men bleeding in the rocks. We had called for support 4 times and been told the weather was too dangerous for flight operations. He paused, a single beat. The weather was dangerous. That's accurate. It was the worst flying conditions I have ever seen in 9 years of deployments, which is why every aircraft we called stayed away. Every aircraft except one. Mercer had gone still. The first thing I heard, Brooks continued, was the cannon, the 30 millimeter. And then I saw the nose. Pink. Coming out of the clouds at about 800 feet, which I'm told is significantly below the safe minimum altitude for combat runs in those conditions. He glanced at the aircraft behind him. It made 6 passes, 6, over ground that was still shooting back. It took a surface-to-air missile on the 6th pass and still managed to hold together long enough for the pilot to eject. The silence around them had grown. The pilot was recovered, Brooks said. She had a shattered leg, 3 cracked vertebrae, and a concussion bad enough to keep her unconscious for 11 hours. And when she woke up, the first thing she did, I know because I was at the medical facility when they told her, was ask whether all of her soldiers made it out. He stopped. He let that sit in the air for a moment. All 23 of them did, he said, because she traded her aircraft and her career for their lives. Mercer opened his mouth, closed it. One of the other pilots, the second one, the grinning one, had stopped grinning. That's, Mercer started. I didn't know that. No, Brooks said simply. You didn't. He did not say it with contempt. He said it with a kind of quiet precision that was in its own way more devastating than anger would have been. Emily had not moved. She was still standing at the edge of the crowd, still gripping her cane, and she was aware of several things simultaneously. She was aware that her heart was doing something complicated inside her chest, something that was not quite pain and not quite relief. She was aware that the group of young pilots had gone completely silent, the laughter extinguished as thoroughly as if a hand had closed around it. She was aware that the ceremony was supposed to have continued 5 minutes ago, and that the base commander was standing near the podium, looking uncertain about whether to intervene. She was also aware that Brooks had turned, and that he was looking directly at her. She had thought she was standing far enough back. She had thought the crowd gave her enough distance. She had thought, and this was the stupid hope she had carried all morning, she could admit it now that she could watch the unveiling without being involved, without being recognized, without having to stand in front of strangers and absorb their reactions to the things she had lost. Captain Hayes, Brooks said. Her name and his voice crossed 40 feet of open runway and landed somewhere in the center of her chest. She did not speak. You want to come up here, he said. It was a question, but only barely. It had the quality of an invitation extended by someone who understood exactly how difficult it would be to accept and was asking anyway. She looked at the aircraft, the pink nose, the cartoon Warthog with its ridiculous expression, the brass plaque she still hadn't read. She looked back at Brooks. I don't think that's necessary, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. It's your moment, Sergeant. I'm just here to... You're here because you were invited, Brooks said. You were invited because it's your aircraft. It's not my aircraft anymore. Yes, he said, it is. He said it with such uncomplicated certainty that she almost believed him. Almost. But 3 years of believing otherwise was a significant counterweight, and she felt it pressing down on her from the inside. The problem with the past is not that it disappears. The problem is that it stays with you in the wrong shape. What Emily carried was not the memory of the mission. She could access that clearly, clinically in precise detail, the way she had always processed information with the kind of sharp recall that had made her exceptional at her job. She remembered the cloud ceiling, the wind shear, the moment the missile warning screamed in her headset, the feeling of the ejection seat firing the hard, cold air, the ground coming up too fast. What she carried was the interpretation she had placed on top of those memories. The version where she made a mistake. The version where she lost the aircraft. The version where the pilot who was supposed to come home whole and intact instead came home broken. Dependent on a cane, retired at 31, watching other people do the things she was built to do. "I lost that aircraft," she said. Brooks shook his head. "You traded it." That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it. He took a step toward her, and there was something deliberate in it, something that required her to stay where she was or make an obvious choice to move away. "You know what I did on the night we made it back to the base after the debrief? After the medical checks, after I'd walked through every man in my platoon and counted them and made sure they were physically present and alive." She waited. "I sat outside the medical tent," Brooks said, "and I tried to figure out how to explain to a pilot I'd never met that she had just changed 23 families, that there were going to be kids who grew up with their fathers because of what happened in that valley, that there were going to be grandchildren who would never know why their grandfather always got quiet when someone flew a plane overhead, that there was a chain of—" He paused, something briefly unsteady in his voice. "A chain of things that were going to happen in the world because of 6 passes over a mountain in bad weather. And I couldn't figure out how to say it, because there isn't a way to say it that carries the actual weight of it." Emily felt something pressing behind her eyes. She had not cried at this ceremony. She had made a promise to herself on the drive down from Tucson. No crying. She was a guest. She was a former military officer. She was going to stand straight and bear it and leave with her dignity intact. "You've been carrying the wrong version of that story," Brooks said quietly. "Sergeant Brooks. You lost a $30 million aircraft, I know. I understand that has consequences. I understand the Air Force had opinions about it. I understand you had to sit across a desk from people who looked at the cost accounting of that decision." He stopped. "But you didn't just lose a plane. You made a choice. You stayed when you had every reason to leave. You made 6 passes when any rational calculus would have told you to turn back after 2. And then you ejected into a mountain and woke up, and your first question was whether your soldiers were alive." She couldn't speak. "You were asking about us," he said. "Before you knew if your own spine was intact, you were asking about us." And there it was. There was the thing she had not been able to say to anyone, not to the counselors, not to the physical therapists, not to the other pilots who checked in occasionally with careful, well-meaning phone calls, not to her parents who had been wonderful and steady and entirely unable to touch the particular wound she was carrying. She had not been asking because she was noble. She had been asking because she was terrified. Because the entire reason she had stayed in that valley, the entire reason she had made pass after pass, despite the warnings and the system screaming and the fuel states declining, was that she could not leave. Physically could not. Some part of her, some deep, non-negotiable piece of the person she was, had looked at those coordinates on the radio, had heard those voices calling for support, had understood that the weather was too dangerous for standard operations, and had decided that the weather's opinion was irrelevant. She had not been brave. She had been unable to do otherwise. And then she had survived and found out what the inability to do otherwise costs, and spent 3 years wondering if the cost was worth it. "The cost was worth it," Brooks said. He must have seen something in her face. "Whatever you're thinking right now, I can guess approximately what it is the cost was worth it." "You can't know what I'm thinking," she said. "I know what I'd be thinking," he said, "if I were you." The young pilots had not moved. They were still standing in their loose cluster near the front of the crowd, and they were watching this conversation with the careful attention of people who have just discovered that a situation is significantly larger than they initially understood. Lieutenant Mercer had his hands at his sides, and his face was doing something complicated. He looked, Emily thought, distantly, like someone trying to build a new understanding from materials they hadn't known they needed. From behind Brooks' movement, she registered it first as a shift in the crowd, a reorientation the way large groups of people unconsciously adjust when something is happening that requires attention. Then she understood what she was seeing. Soldiers. Not 1 or 2, not a small group. An entire formation of them moving from their scattered positions across the runway area and gathering behind Sergeant Brooks with a quiet, organized precision that spoke of long practice. They were Army infantry, most of them combat patches on their right shoulders, expressions that communicated something collective and specific that Emily didn't have a word for yet. She counted. She got to 20 before she stopped counting. "These are the men from the valley," Brooks said, and Emily Hayes, who had held herself steady through the laughter and the ceremony and the memories and the 3 years of physical therapy and the conversation and all of it. Emily Hayes felt something give way in making her like a load-bearing wall, finally accepting that it had held enough weight for long enough. She did not collapse. She would not collapse. She was stubborn in ways that ran too deep for collapse. But her eyes, which she had kept carefully dry all morning, made their own decision. "They drove," Brooks said. "Some of them drove from as far as New Mexico. One of them, Corporal Martinez, the tall one in the back, flew in from Georgia last night. They didn't know you'd be here. I told them about the ceremony. I told them about the aircraft. I told them we were going to come and stand in front of that pink Warthog and let people know what it actually represented." "You didn't have to do that," Emily said. Her voice had changed quality, something rougher in it now. "We know we didn't have to," Brooks said. "That's the point." The platoon stood behind him. 23 soldiers, standing between Emily Hayes and anyone who would laugh at a pink aircraft without knowing its history. And the strange thing, the thing that would stay with her, was that they were not performing anything. They were not putting on a show for the crowd or making a statement for the journalists with their cameras. They were just standing there the way they had stood in a mountain valley in Afghanistan, waiting for a pilot to come back around for another pass. Patient, present, unmoving. "Captain Hayes," said a voice from the formation, not Brooks, younger. She found the face a soldier no older than 25, narrow-shouldered, with dark eyes that had seen things beyond his years. "Corporal Martinez," Brooks murmured to her, confirming. "I just want to say one thing," Martinez said. His voice was steady but effortful, the kind of steady that people achieve when they have rehearsed what they are going to say so many times that the emotion can no longer shake the delivery, but still runs clearly underneath it. "My daughter is 4 years old. She doesn't know anything about Afghanistan. She doesn't know anything about what happened in that valley. She just knows her dad came home." He stopped, started again. "I need her to keep not knowing that for as long as possible, and she gets to not know it because of you." Emily pressed her lips together, held it together. Barely. "Okay," she said. It was not a sufficient response to what he had said. She knew that. She said it anyway because it was the only word she had. "Okay," she said again, softer. Lieutenant Mercer took a step forward from his cluster of pilots. Everyone in the vicinity went very slightly tense, not because he seemed threatening, but because whatever was about to happen next was unscripted and the crowd could feel it. "I owe you an apology," Mercer said. He was talking to Emily directly. His voice was precise in the way that Air Force officers train themselves to be precise, but underneath it was something genuine, something that was doing its best to come through the professional vocabulary and be honestly felt rather than merely correctly stated. "I made a judgment about something I didn't understand. It was disrespectful. I'm sorry." Emily looked at him for a moment. "How long have you been flying?" she asked. He blinked, not expecting the question. 4 years. Just got F-35 qualified 6 months ago." "Good aircraft," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "The A-10 was better at what I needed it to be," she said. "That's not an insult to the F-35. They're built for different things. But when you need to stay in one place and keep a column of infantry alive, there is nothing on earth like 30 millimeters of titanium-reinforced conviction flying at 200 feet. Mercer nodded. "When you're in a situation someday," she said, "where the easy answer is to stay away, and you'll have that situation. They all come eventually. I want you to remember that there is also a harder answer." She paused. "The harder answer is sometimes the right one." She wasn't sure why she said it. She hadn't planned to. The words came out of somewhere below, conscious intention, out of the 3 years of guilt and grief and the morning's accumulated weight, out of the specific shape of 23 soldiers standing behind Sergeant Brooks in the Arizona sunlight. Mercer stood there for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and something in the way he said it told her that he had understood. Brooks turned back to her. "I want to show you the plaque," he said. "I haven't read it," she admitted. "I know. I watched you when the cover came off. You were looking at the aircraft, not the plaque." The aircraft was a lot to process. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They walked toward the memorial together. Emily and Brooks with the platoon falling in behind them in a loose, natural formation. not military precision, just 23 men moving in the same direction with the same purpose. The crowd shifted and parted to let them through, and the journalists raised their cameras, and the base commander stepped back from the podium and let it happen, because even someone who had not been in that valley could recognize that something was occurring that did not need official management. The plaque was bronze. It had been set into the concrete pad at the base of the aircraft's nose gear low enough that you had to look down to read it, which meant you were also looking up at the pink cartoon Warthog painted above you. Emily read it. She read it twice. It said, "In memory of the mission of Pink Warthog, for the pilots who stay when others cannot, for the soldiers who carry their own home, in honor of courage that did not ask to be beautiful." She stood there for a long time. The Arizona wind moved across the runway. Behind her, she could hear Brooks's soldiers, 23 of them, simply present. She thought about the morning she had authorized that nose art. Her crew chief had laughed so hard he'd nearly dropped his coffee. She'd told him that nobody would ever let her fly a combat aircraft painted pink, and he'd said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, I think you could fly anything anywhere." And she had believed him because, in those days, she believed she could do anything. She had been right. She just hadn't understood the full shape of what anything included. "I keep thinking," she said to nobody in particular, to Brooks, to the aircraft, to the desert, "that I lost." "I know," Brooks said. "The aircraft is gone. The career is gone. She stopped, gestured vaguely at the cane. "All of it. I think of it as something that was taken." "What was taken," Brooks said carefully, "and what was given are not always the same thing, even when they come from the same moment." She looked at the plaque again. "Courage that did not ask to be beautiful." "Who wrote this?" she asked. "Martinez," Brooks said. "He went through 12 drafts." She almost smiled. "Almost." "Tell him," she said. "Tell him what?" "Tell him it's right." Brooks nodded. The ceremony eventually continued. The base commander returned to the podium and said the words that official ceremonies require, and the journalists took their photographs, and the crowd gradually returned to the ordinary business of a military memorial on a sharp October morning in Arizona. But something had shifted in the space around the pink Warthog. The laughter was gone, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Several of the young pilots came forward eventually and stood in front of the aircraft and looked at it differently, not admiringly exactly, not with the theatrical reverence of a converted mind, but with genuine curiosity, which is the beginning of understanding and therefore the most honest thing they could offer. Emily stood at the edge of it. She watched Corporal Martinez explain something to Lieutenant Mercer using his hands to indicate altitude and angles, and Mercer listening with his full attention, and she thought about the chain of things Brooks had mentioned, the families that existed because of 6 passes over a mountain, the children growing up without knowing why, the grandchildren who would never come to be if a different choice had been made, the chain of things that do not exist if you turn back. She thought about that. She thought about it for a long time, and somewhere in the middle of thinking about it, the thing she had been carrying for 3 years, the specific weight of the interpretation she had placed on top of the facts, the version where she lost, the version where the cost was greater than the result, the version where Emily Hayes ended in that valley, instead of continuing beyond it, that thing shifted. Not disappeared. She was realistic enough to know it would not disappear. But it shifted, it adjusted, it moved into a position where it was part of the story instead of the conclusion of the story. She looked at the pink Warthog, the ridiculous cartoon, the bright neon color that had once been a $20 bet between a pilot and her crew chief, the aircraft that had been laughed at this morning by people who saw a surface and stopped there. She thought, "I flew that." And then she thought for the first time in 3 years without immediately burying it beneath the weight of everything that came after, "I would fly it again." The silence that followed those 23 men stepping forward lasted exactly 4 seconds. Emily counted them. She had always counted things under pressure. Altitude, airspeed, fuel state, seconds between missile warning and impact. It was how her brain processed situations that were too large for immediate comprehension. Reduce them to numbers. Numbers give the chaos a shape, find the edge of it. 4 seconds of silence on that Arizona runway. And then Sergeant Brooks spoke again. "You want to know why that aircraft is pink?" he said. He was still looking at Mercer, still with that same unnerving quiet. "Then let me tell you what happened in a valley in Afghanistan on the 14th of November 3 years ago. And I want you to stand there and listen to every word." Mercer stood there. "I didn't have a choice, really. Not with 23 soldiers at his back and 200 people watching and the base commander making no move to intervene. The situation had its own gravity now, and Mercer was caught inside it. It started at 0400, Brooks said, and with those 4 words, Emily felt the Arizona morning disappear. She was back there before she could stop herself. That's the thing about certain memories, they don't wait for permission. They come when something triggers them, and the trigger doesn't have to be dramatic. It can be a word, tone of voice, the specific way a man with combat experience sets his feet before he begins to speak about something that cost him something real, 0400. She had been in her aircraft at 0400, engines running, weather report in hand, the report that said ceiling at 400 feet, wind shear at altitude, precipitation, and 0 visibility in the target area. The report that said, in the professional language of meteorological assessment, that flying into that valley was not a rational operational choice. She had read it 3 times. Then she had taxied to the runway anyway. But Brooks was telling a different part of the story, his part. The part she had never heard directly, because by the time she woke up in the medical facility, his platoon had already been moved, and the debrief she participated in was conducted by officers who spoke about the mission. In aggregate terms, assets deployed, objectives, achieved, casualties, sustained. And nobody sat across from her and said, "Let me tell you what it looked like from the ground." "We'd been in that valley for 6 hours before everything went wrong," Brooks said. His voice had shifted slightly, taking on the cadence of someone who has told a story before, but is choosing to tell it completely, this time holding nothing back. The mission was straightforward: escort a logistics convoy through a secondary route, avoid the main road because we'd had 3 IED incidents in the previous 2 weeks. Simple. 4 hours and 4 hours out. He paused. It took 11 minutes for simple to become catastrophic. That landed in the crowd the way truth lands when it's delivered without decoration. Several people shifted their weight. A few of the younger soldiers in the gathered platoon made small involuntary movements, a jaw tightening. A breath adjusted the body's memory, responding to words that matched its own experience. The first contact came from the North Ridgeline, Brooks continued. Heavy machine gun PKM well positioned. Before we could respond, we took contact from the south as well, which meant we were in a crossfire in a valley with walls on 2 sides with a convoy that couldn't move because the lead vehicle had taken an RPG and was blocking the road. He looked at the pink Warthog. I got on the radio inside the first 3 minutes, called for close air support, gave our position, gave the threat assessment, gave the number of casualties we had already taken. He turned back to Mercer. "You know what I got back?" Mercer shook his head. "I got a weather report," Brooks said. "A very accurate, very professional weather report explaining that air operations in the target area were suspended due to ceiling and visibility, which I already knew, which I could see with my own eyes, which was why we were still in the valley with 3 wounded men and no avenue of withdrawal." Emily remembered receiving that transmission, the frantic quality of it, the voices underneath Brooks's controlled professional language, the other voices in the background of the radio. Call the ones that weren't trying to be professional, the ones that were just scared. She had sat in her aircraft at the end of the runway with the engines at idle and listened to that transmission and felt something in her chest that she had never been able to name precisely. Not anger, not courage, something more basic than either of those things. As an ability to leave. I called for support 4 times in the first hour, Brooks said. 4 separate transmissions, each one more specific than the last. By the 3rd call, I was telling them the exact grid coordinates of the machine gun positions. By the 4th call, I was telling them we had men who were going to bleed out if we didn't get fire support in the next 20 minutes. He stopped, a full stop, not a dramatic pause. A man choosing his next words very carefully. The 4th call came back with the same answer. Weather, safety of flight, no available assets willing to operate in those conditions. "Willing," said a voice from the platoon behind him. It was quiet, it wasn't accusatory, it was just the word repeated the way you repeat a word that has an edge to it. Brooks nodded. "Willing," he confirmed. He let that sit for exactly long enough. And then he said something changed. Emily knew what came next. She had lived what came next. But there is a profound difference between knowing a story from the inside and hearing it told from the outside, and she discovered in that moment that 3 years had not prepared her for the particular quality of hearing her own actions described by someone who had watched them from the ground. Private First Class Delgado was the one who heard it first, Brooks said. He grabbed my arm. He said, "Sergeant, you hear that?" And I said I didn't hear anything. And he said exactly. The machine gun on the North Ridge stopped. Brooks bite into the pocket of his uniform jacket. His hand came out with something small and worn. He held it loosely, not displaying it, just holding it the way people hold things that matter. 20 seconds later, Brooks said, "We heard the engine, A-10 distinctive sound, nothing else in the world sounds like it. And it was low, lower than anything should have been flying in those conditions. Lower than anything I had ever heard fly in 9 years of deployments." He shook his head, a small motion. I looked up and I saw the nose of that aircraft coming through the cloud layer at maybe 800 feet, and I actually thought that the pilot had gotten lost, that the visibility had gone to zero, and they had descended too far and were about to. He stopped himself. And then the 30mm opened up, he said, and I understood that nobody was lost. In the crowd, nobody spoke. Emily realized she had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of his sentence and was only now remembering to resume. "First pass took out the North Ridge position completely," Brooks said. The machine gun went silent. I heard the aircraft climbing back into the clouds. I got on the radio and I said, he almost smiled, a complicated expression with too many things in it to be simply called a smile. I said, "Pink Warthog, this is Grizzly. Actual, please confirm you are on station." And the reply came back immediately. Calm, like this was entirely routine. Like she was reading a weather report herself. He shifted his weight. "Grizzly, actual, Pink Warthog confirms on station. I have your position marked. Give me your southern threat grid." Emily heard her own voice in his recounting of it. That particular cadence she had used in the cockpit, the one that required years of practice to produce naturally, the one that communicated to the people on the ground that the situation was manageable, not because it objectively was, but because someone with authority over the next 60 seconds had decided to treat it that way. I gave her the grid, Brooks said. 30 seconds later, the second pass went in on the southern position. He paused. Then he said something that Emily had not expected. "She was talking to us the whole time," he said. "Between passes, climbing back into the clouds, reorienting for the next run, she was on the radio, not giving status updates, not requesting information, just talking." Several people in the crowd exchanged looks. This was not standard procedure. This was not what the mission reports reflected. This was something that existed only in the memory of the men on the ground. She said, "How are you wounded?" between the second and third pass, just asked, like someone checking on a friend. Brooks looked directly at Emily. "I told her we had 3 down, 2 serious. She said, 'I'm going to need you to move them to the southern edge of your position before my next pass because I'm going to make some noise on your north side and I don't want debris coming down on your people.'" And then she added, "I need you to understand, this was between the 3rd and 4th combat run, while she was flying through precipitation and wind shear at below safe altitude," she added. "You're doing great down there. Hold on a little longer." Someone in the platoon behind Brooks made a sound that was not quite a word. Emily pressed her lips together so hard she could feel her teeth behind them. "You're doing great down there," Brooks repeated. In the middle of all that, that's what she said. He turned to face the assembled crowd, not just Mercer, all of them. He held up whatever was in his hand, and Emily could see it now. A patch military unit, patch the edges worn, and the colors faded from years of handling. "The 5th pass took a hit," Brooks said. "We didn't know from the ground exactly what had happened, but we saw the aircraft shudder, saw it lose altitude for a moment before recovering. I got on the radio and I said, 'Pink Warthog report status.' And she said, 'Bah.'" He stopped a brief stop control. "I'm still here. Stand by for 6th pass. Still here. I'm still here." Emily had said that. She remembered saying it. She remembered the warning lights that were telling her she had hydraulic damage and a partial engine loss in a fuel state that was deteriorating faster than it should have been. And she remembered doing the math in her head, the rapid instinctive calculation of what she had left versus what the people on the ground still needed, and arriving at an answer that was not complicated. One more pass. She had enough for one more pass. 6th pass went in on a mortar position that had been setting up on the eastern approach, Brooks said. "The position that would have cut off our only remaining avenue of withdrawal." He paused. "That's the pass where the missile hit. The crowd was absolutely still. We saw the explosion from the ground, Brooks said. We saw the aircraft come out of it, still flying barely at maybe 400 feet, and then we saw the ejection seat fire. He swallowed. The first visible display of emotion a single swallow quickly controlled. We tracked the chute. We moved to the landing site as fast as we could move, with wounded men and active enemy contact. We got there before anyone else. He looked at Emily. She was conscious when we found her, he said, barely. Her leg was broken in 2 places. We found out later her spine had 3 compressed vertebrae. She had a concussion that should have put her out completely. He held her gaze. And the first thing she said to us, the first coherent words, before we'd even fully secured the position was, "Did everyone make it out?" The silence lasted 6 seconds this time. Emily counted. "Not where am I?" Brooks said. "Not how bad is it? Not anything about herself." The first thing she said was about the people she'd come down there to protect. He finally looked away from Emily and she felt the release of it like a physical thing, like pressure equalizing. "We told her yes," he said. "We told her everyone made it out, all 23 of us." He paused. She said good, and then she passed out, and we carried her 2 kilometers through active contact to the casualty collection point. He turned back to Mercer. "That," he said, "is whose aircraft you were laughing at." Mercer had not moved in a long time. He was standing with his hands at his sides and his face carrying an expression that had gone through several visible phases in the last 10 minutes. Amusement, discomfort, surprise, genuine shock, and something that was now settling into a kind of reckoning that had no performance in it at all. He started. "I'm not finished," Brooks said. "Not harsh, just factual." Mercer closed his mouth. "After the mission," Brooks said, "I put in a formal recommendation, 3 pages, specific. Every pass documented every decision point, every moment where a pilot operating within standard parameters would have turned back, and she didn't." He paused. "You know what happened to it?" Nobody answered. "It went through 4 levels of review," Brooks said, "and at the 4th level it got modified. Not rejected, modified. The language that specifically cited her decision to operate below safe minimums was removed. Because officially operating below safe minimums is a violation, not a distinction. And the Air Force, and I say this with genuine respect for the institution, the Air Force couldn't officially commend someone for breaking a rule, even when breaking the rule saved 23 lives. He let that land. So her record shows a mission where she lost an aircraft, he said, where she violated flight safety parameters, where she was medically discharged because her injuries were too severe for return to flight status. He stopped. It does not show what actually happened in that valley. It does not show what we saw. It does not show what she said between combat passes. It does not show that she asked about her soldiers before she knew if her own spine was intact. Emily had not known about the recommendation. She had not known it existed, had not known it had been modified, had not known that Brooks had spent 3 pages of formal documentation trying to give her record a different shape. She had known about the review of her flight parameters. She had sat across from a panel of officers who had explained professionally and not unkindly that her decisions had resulted in the loss of a $30 million aircraft, and that while the outcome for the soldiers on the ground was positive, the method could not be officially endorsed. She had said, "Yes, sir," and "No, sir," and "I understand," and she had meant all of it. She had never known there were 3 pages somewhere that said something different. "Brooks," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't tell me," she said. "No," he said. "Why?" I was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because at the time I didn't know if it mattered. You were still in medical. We'd been moved to a different operational area. And by the time I understood what had happened to the recommendation, what had been removed, I thought maybe knowing would make it worse, not better." "It would have," she said. "I know. That's why I didn't tell you then." He paused. "But that was 3 years ago, and I've watched what 3 years of carrying the wrong version of a story does to a person. You've been watching me." "Not closely," he said. "But yes, some of us have kept track." She absorbed this. The idea that 23 men had been keeping track of her for 3 years. Not intrusively, not with any agenda she could identify. Just keeping track the way you keep track of someone who matters to you. Checking on the shape of their life. The way you might check a compass bearing, not obsessively, but regularly to know the direction of things. "Martinez found your address," Brooks said. About 2 years ago, we didn't do anything with it, but we had it, in case. In case of what? In case of something like this, he said. From behind him, Corporal Martinez spoke again. We tried to find you after the mission, he said, while you were still in medical. They wouldn't tell us where you were. Patient privacy, that's the rule we understood. But we couldn't, he stopped. Started again. It felt wrong to come home and not be able to say it to you directly. That you'd another stop. His voice was having difficulty with something. That what you did for us was something we thought about every day. Not in a heavy way. Just in the way you think about things that change the direction of everything. Emily looked at Martinez. He was young, younger than she remembered soldiers being. Though she knew this was not accurate, she had been younger too once. But there was something about his face that carried the particular kind of age that combat puts on people without adding years to their birth date. An age of the eyes, of the way they moved, of the specific quality of attention they gave to everything. How old is your daughter now? She asked. He blinked, surprised by the question. 4, he said. 4 years old. What's her name? Sophia, Emily nodded. Sophia, she said, and she did not say anything else about it because there was nothing else that needed to be said. From the other side of the gathered crowd, one of the other pilots from Mercer's group spoke up. Not Mercer, the second one, the grinning one who had stopped grinning. Sergeant Brooks, he said. Brooks looked at him. Did she? The pilot stopped. He was perhaps 28, and he had the look of someone reformulating a question. Mid-sentence, because the question he had started to ask revealed something about himself that he was not comfortable revealing. Was there a point in the mission where she could have turned back, where it would have been defensible? After the second pass, Brooks said without hesitating. By the second pass, she'd neutralized the most immediate threats. We still had the southern position in the mortar setup, but we had a potential extraction route that wasn't available before the second pass. By any reasonable operational standard, 2 passes in those conditions was already beyond what was required. But she stayed, the pilot said. She stayed. The pilot nodded slowly. Because we were still there, Brooks said. That was the reason. We were still there and the mortar position was setting up, and turning back would have meant leaving people in a situation that had improved but hadn't resolved. And he paused, and for the first time something shifted in his expression toward something that was harder to categorize, something more personal than the controlled recounting of facts. She had a very specific idea about what resolve meant. Emily heard that. She heard it, and she recognized it because it was true. She had a specific idea about what resolve meant. She always had. Her flight instructor at the academy had called it admirable in simulations and terrifying in real-world application. And she had understood what he meant and done it anyway for 11 years without event, until the one event that defined everything after. The thing about flying CAS, she said, and her voice surprised her by being steady, close air support, she meant, and most of the crowd understood, is that you're not flying a mission. You're flying a relationship. The people on the ground are not a grid coordinate on a targeting map. They are people who are scared and tired and counting on the sound of your engines. The moment you go to afterburner and climb away, they know it. They feel it. Even if it's the right tactical choice, they feel it. She looked at the pink Warthog. I couldn't feel that way, she said. Couldn't be the thing that went away. Not while they were still down there. That's not doctrine, Mercer said. No, she agreed. It's not. It's also what kept 23 people alive, Brooks said. Mercer nodded. He nodded like a man who has just learned something that is going to take a considerable amount of time to fully integrate and who has accepted that this is appropriate given what he has learned. An older man in the crowd, civilian clothes, Vietnam-era veteran, by the patches on his cap, spoke from about 15 feet back. He hadn't been part of the conversation. He had just been listening. Son, he said to Mercer. Mercer turned. You want to know the difference between the pilots who get remembered and the ones who don't? Mercer waited. The ones who get remembered, the old man said, stayed when leaving was an option. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The base commander had approached the edge of the gathered group, and Emily saw him exchange a look with the senior NCO standing at his shoulder. Whatever the commander had planned to say, whatever official schedule they were now running behind, he appeared to have made a decision about the relative importance of schedule versus what was happening in front of him, because he stepped back without speaking. Brooks reached into his jacket again. He removed the patch. Emily had seen it in his hand earlier, but not closely, not with the full attention she gave it now. It was a unit patch, the kind worn on the upper left sleeve, and it had the specific look of something that had been handled repeatedly over a period of years. The edges were worn soft. The colors had shifted from whatever they had originally been toward a more muted version of themselves. The thread was intact, but the stiffness was gone, replaced by a suppleness that came from regular contact with human hands. "I've been carrying this for 3 years," Brooks said. "So," he held it out toward Emily. She looked at it. She did not take it immediately, not because she didn't want to, because she understood that the act of taking it was going to change something, was going to make permanent a version of the story that she had not yet fully allowed herself to inhabit. The version where she had not lost. The version where the cost had been real and significant and legitimate and also worth it. The version that had been true all along, but required 23 men driving across state lines to make her finally stand still long enough to hear it. "That's our unit patch," Brooks said. "Our platoon, from the deployment." He paused. "We had a discussion, the men, after I told them about the ceremony, about coming here, about what we wanted to say." He stopped again. "We decided we wanted you to have it, as a record of what actually happened." Emily looked at the patch. Then she looked at the 23 men behind him. "You drove across several states," she said. "Some of us," Brooks said. "Martinez flew." "I drove from New Mexico," said a voice in the back. 12 hours, left at 9 last night." 14 from Colorado," said another. She looked at them. These men who had carried her out of a valley in Afghanistan, who had reported her first words to the medics, who had kept her address in case of something like this, who had driven through the night because Sergeant Brooks had called them and told them where she was going to be. She reached out and took the patch. It was lighter than she expected, softer, worn down by years of someone's hands. "Thank you," she said. The words were completely inadequate, and she knew it, and she said them anyway because they were real, which made them the best words available. "Captain Hayes," said Brooks. She looked up. "The aircraft's name," he said. "Pink Warthog. We had a conversation about that too, about where the name came from." He tilted his head slightly. "Was it really a $20 bet?" She almost laughed. The sound that came out of her wasn't quite a laugh, but it had the shape of one. "My crew chief," she said. "Sergeant Torres. He bet me I wouldn't put a cartoon on a combat aircraft. I told him, you don't know me very well, Torres." "Did he pay up?" Brooks asked. "He tried to get out of it," she said. "He said the aircraft getting shot down voided the bet." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the aircraft wasn't shot down. It was retired early due to structural disagreements with a surface-to-air missile, and that the cartoon was on it when it went down, which fulfilled the terms." She paused. "He paid." Behind Brooks, somebody in the platoon laughed. A real laugh. A brief one. The kind that breaks through in moments of genuine surprise. And then one by one others joined it. Not the hollow laughter that had opened the morning. Not the contemptuous performance of people laughing at something they didn't understand. But the laughter of people who had been holding a great deal of very heavy weight and found in a story about a $20 bet in a cartoon Warthog, a moment where the weight briefly became something they could set down. Emily Hayes, standing on an Arizona runway with a worn unit patch in her hand and a cane she needed to stand straight, and 3 years of the wrong version of a story finally beginning to shift into something she could live alongside. Emily Hayes heard that laughter and felt it land differently than any laughter she had heard in a very long time. It felt, she thought, like something that belonged to her. It felt like something she had earned. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Emily with an expression that had shed the last of its professional distance and was simply plainly human. "Captain Hayes," he said, "I'd like to know if you were willing to tell it what it sounded like. In the cockpit. On those passes." Emily looked at him for a long moment. "You actually want to know," she said. "Yes," he said, "I do." She looked at the pink Warthog. She thought about the cloud ceiling and the wind shear and the 30-millimeter rounds walking across a ridgeline, and the voices on the radio, the professional voice of Brooks, and underneath it, the other voices, the ones that were just frightened and alive, and asking without asking to remain that way. "Like everything that matters," she said finally. "Like something you can't walk away from." Part 3, What the Ground Remembers. Mercer's question hung in the air for a moment after Emily answered it, like something you can't walk away from. He nodded slowly, absorbing it, the way you absorb something that reorders your understanding of a thing you thought you already understood. He had been flying for 4 years. He had logged hundreds of hours. He had sat in cockpits through weather and mechanical failures in situations that required fast decisions and clean execution. But he had never not once been in a situation where the choice was stay or leave people behind. He had never had to make that particular calculation. And listening to Emily speak about it, not with drama, not with the performed gravity of someone recounting a heroic story, but with the quiet precision of someone describing a fact about themselves that they have only recently been able to look at directly, he understood that there was a category of experience he had not yet entered. He hoped in some private part of himself that he would enter it the right way when the time came. It was 10:47 in the morning now. The ceremony had dissolved into something that nobody had planned and nobody was going to stop. The base commander had given up on the schedule entirely and was standing at the edge of the gathered crowd with his hands clasped behind his back, watching with the expression of a man who has learned to recognize when an institution is doing something more important than its own agenda. The journalists were still there. 2 of them had their cameras up. Emily noticed this and said nothing about it. There was nothing in what was happening that required protection from cameras. Everything being said on this runway was something she would be willing to say again in any room, to any audience. That was new. 3 hours ago, she had not been willing to say any of it. A soldier from the back of the platoon worked his way forward. He was thicker through the shoulders than most of the others, with close-cropped gray at his temples that put him a few years older than Brooks. His name tape said Okafor. He stopped at Brooks's shoulder and looked at Emily with an expression that was direct and uncomplicated and entirely serious. "Ma'am," he said. "Sergeant Okafor," Emily said, reading his rank. "Staff Sergeant," he corrected without any edge to it, just accurate. "Staff Sergeant Okafor," she said. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something Sergeant Brooks didn't include in his account. With your permission." Brooks glanced at him but said nothing. Whatever Okafor was about to say had not been pre-coordinated. This was one soldier deciding in real time that the moment required something additional. "Go ahead," Emily said. "On the 4th pass," Okafor said. "I was the one on the radio. Brooks had taken some fragmentation from the mortar rounds. Nothing serious, but his headset was damaged, and we had about 40 seconds where he was out of contact. So I was talking to you." Emily looked at him. "I remember the voice," she said carefully. "I didn't know who it was." "It was me," Okafor said, and he stopped. He was not a man who stopped easily. She could tell that from the way he carried himself. This stop was deliberate. He was choosing the words, not struggling to find them. "I told you we were losing men. I said it to get you to stay. I said it because I was scared and we were pinned down and I needed you to make one more pass." He paused. "But it wasn't accurate. At that point, we had wounded, but we hadn't lost anyone yet." The runway was very quiet. "I lied to a combat pilot to keep her on station," Okafor said. "And then she took a missile. And I've thought about that, about whether what I said had anything to do with her making that 6th pass for 3 years. Emily stared at him. She had thought about the 6th pass more times than she could count. She had analyzed it from every angle she had access to. Fuel state threat assessment, the mortar position on the eastern approach that needed to be suppressed before the platoon could withdraw. She had concluded each time she reviewed it that the 6th pass was necessary regardless of anything she had been told. The mortar position was real. The threat was real. If she had climbed away after 5 passes without suppressing that position, the platoon's withdrawal route would have been cut off within 20 minutes. "Staff Sergeant," she said. He met her eyes. "The 6th pass was already decided before your transmission," she said. "I had seen the mortar team setting up on the eastern approach on my 5th pass. I was going to go in regardless of what you told me. Whatever you said didn't change the decision." Okafor held her gaze. "You can't know that for certain," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I know what I saw on the 5th pass, and I know what I would have done about it." I was quiet for a long moment. "I've been carrying that for 3 years," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Put it down." He breathed out through his nose. A single long breath. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Behind her, she heard one of the journalists adjust his position. She registered it without turning. She was not performing for the cameras. She was not aware of them the way a person is aware of something they want to account for. She was simply aware of them, the way you are aware of weather present, noted irrelevant to the immediate situation. Brooks looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. You didn't know about Okafor's transmission, he said. Not specifically, she said. The details of individual transmissions weren't something I retained with precision. I retained the aggregate, the state of the ground situation, the threat picture, the fuel and weapon status. Individual words got compressed. That's interesting, Mercer said from his position nearby. He had not moved far. He had found a spot at the edge of the conversation where he could listen without intruding. And he had occupied it with the careful attention of someone who has decided that listening is the most valuable thing he can do right now. In the F-35, we have voice recording. Everything in the cockpit is captured. A-10 had it too, Emily said. The investigation reviewed the recordings. What did they find? What they found, Emily said, was a pilot operating outside approved parameters who successfully supported the ground element but failed to recover the aircraft. She paused. Which is accurate. That's all they found, Mercer said. That's all that fit in the official record, she said. The distinction between those two things settled over the gathered crowd like something with weight. It was then that one of the other soldiers spoke. He had been standing toward the outer edge of the platoon formation, and Emily had not focused on him specifically until his voice pulled her attention. He was young, possibly the youngest person in the formation, 22 at most, with a face that still had something unfinished about it, something not yet fully resolved into the person he was going to be. His name tape said Kowalski. Captain Hayes, he said, can I ask something? Yes. Were you scared, he said, up there, on those passes? Several people in the crowd seemed to hold their breath. It was the kind of question that only young people ask directly because they haven't yet learned that directness about fear is considered a social risk. Emily looked at him for a moment. What's your first name, Kowalski? She said. Danny, he said. Danny, she said. How old are you? 22, ma'am. How long have you been Army? 3 years. I was 19 in that valley. He paused. It was my first deployment. Emily absorbed this. 19 years old, first deployment, trapped in a valley with enemy fire from 3 directions and a pilot on the radio between combat passes asking how his wounded were doing. Yes, she said. I was scared. Kowalski nodded as if this confirmed something important. What does it feel like, he said, being scared up there? It feels like information, Emily said. That's the best way I can describe it. Fear in a cockpit is not different from fear on the ground in the sense that it's unpleasant and physical and tries to make decisions for you. What's different is that you've been trained very specifically and for a very long time to treat it as data, not as a command, just data. She paused. So on the first pass, my body was telling me this is dangerous. The conditions are outside approved parameters. The threat level is significant. And my brain said, yes, I know now. Let me use that information to fly this aircraft correctly. And on the 6th pass, Kowalski said, on the 6th pass, she said, my body was telling me the aircraft is damaged. The fuel state is critical. Another missile could come from anywhere. And my brain said, yes, and there is a mortar team on the eastern approach that will kill these men if I don't suppress it. So let me use that information to fly this aircraft correctly one more time. Kowalski looked at her. That's not how I would have described fear, he said. How would you describe it? He thought about it honestly. Like something that wants to eat you from the inside, he said. That too, Emily said. Both things are true. Kowalski nodded again. Brooks had been watching this exchange with an expression that Emily was beginning to recognize the look of a man who has organized something and is watching it become something larger than he organized. He had come to the ceremony with specific intentions. A tribute, a defense of a pilot's honor, a reckoning with the laughter that had greeted a pink aircraft. He had achieved all of those things in the first 30 minutes. What was happening now was something he hadn't planned and couldn't have predicted. It was the kind of thing that happens when enough people who have been carrying something alone for long enough finally find themselves in the same place at the same time. The stories started coming, not from everyone, not in an organized way, but from different voices in the platoon offered into the space the way you offer things into a campfire, not because you have to, but because the fire is there and the night is cold, and you are among people who will understand what you're burning. A soldier named Reyes, compact with a stillness that came from somewhere deep, said, I called my mother the morning after. First thing, before the debrief, before I'd even slept. I just needed to hear her voice. He paused. She asked me what happened, and I said nothing. Everything is fine. I just wanted to talk. And she knew I was lying, but she also knew enough not to push. So we talked about nothing for 45 minutes. What she had for dinner, what the neighbor's dog had done to her garden. He stopped. I never told her about the valley, but I think about it every time I call her, which is every week now, every single week. Nobody responded immediately. Then Kowalski said, I called my dad. Yeah, Reyes said. He's a plumber, Kowalski said. He doesn't talk much. I told him I was okay. He said, good. And then he said, you need anything? And I said, no. And he said, okay, come home when you can. And that was it. He paused. That was enough. Emily listened to this and felt something she hadn't expected to feel at a military ceremony on an Arizona runway. She felt the particular warmth of being in the presence of people who had decided that honesty was worth more than performance. She had spent 3 years in the presence of people who were trying to help her. Counselors, doctors, fellow veterans, her parents, friends from before the crash. All of them good people, all of them trying. But there is a specific quality to the presence of people who have been through the same category of thing, and you cannot manufacture it, and you cannot substitute anything else for it, and Emily had not known how much she had missed it until she was standing inside it. I want to ask you something, Emily said to Brooks. He turned. The recommendation, she said. The 3-page recommendation that got modified. What exactly did the modification remove? Brooks was quiet for a moment, deciding how much of this to say in this setting. The original language, he said, specifically cited your decision to fly below safe minimums as an example of judgment that saved lives when strict adherence to protocol would have resulted in greater casualties. He paused. The modified version retained the commendation, but removed the specific characterization of the protocol deviation as a positive factor. So it kept the result, Emily said, but removed the decision. Yes, that's actually coherent, Emily said. From an institutional standpoint, you can't officially tell pilots that breaking safety rules is laudable, even when it is. I understand that, Brooks said. I understood it when they explained it. I still think it was wrong. Both things can be true, Emily said. Yeah, Brooks said. They can. Mercer cleared his throat. Everyone looked at him. I had been listening to this specific exchange with the attention of someone for whom it was professionally significant, not just emotionally significant. Can I say something, he said. Go ahead, Brooks said. Mercer looked at Emily. I've been flying for 4 years, he said. F-35, as you know, best aircraft in the inventory. The systems, the avionics, the situational awareness, capability. It's extraordinary. He paused. And the one thing I've thought about more than anything else since you started talking is I don't know. I don't know if I have what you have. Whatever that thing is that made it impossible for you to leave. He stopped. I'm not saying I don't. I'm saying I genuinely don't know. And I think not knowing is the thing I'm most uncomfortable with. Emily looked at him for a long time. You want my honest opinion? She said. Yes. You don't know until the moment, she said. Nobody knows until the moment. I didn't know until I was on that runway at 0400 with a weather report that said, go back to bed. I didn't know until I was climbing into the cloud layer on the first pass. I didn't know until the missile hit on the 6th. She paused. What matters is not what you think you'll do. What matters is what you've built yourself into by the time the moment arrives. And how do you build that, Mercer said. You make the hard choice every time there's a hard choice, she said. Starting with the small ones. You don't skip the parts of training that are uncomfortable. You don't look away from the parts of your job that are frightening. You get a clear picture of what you're actually defending, and why not the abstraction of it, the specific human reality of it, and you keep that picture with you in the cockpit. She paused. And when you're doing close air support, you listen to the voices on the radio, not just for the information they're giving you, for the fact that they are people, specific people, with names and mothers and children and a strong preference for remaining alive. Mercer was quiet. That's what I heard, Emily said. On those passes, I heard specific people, and that made leaving a thing I was incapable of. The journalist with the camera had lowered it slightly, not off entirely, but lowered. as if he had become more interested in listening than in capturing. From somewhere in the platoon, a voice said, "She remembered my name." The crowd shifted toward the voice. It was a soldier named Washington. He had not spoken before. He was medium height with the kind of build that suggested someone who ran long distances regularly, and his expression was private in a way that suggested he had not planned to speak and was now adjusting to the fact that he had. "On the second pass," he said, "I was treating a casualty on the south side of the position, Private Torres. Not your crew chief, ma'am. Different Torres. He'd taken fragmentation in the upper arm, and I was packing the wound. And Brooks got on the radio to update your position information, and he gave her our names, the names of the wounded, for some reason. I don't know why he did that." Brooks said, "I thought it might matter." "It did," Washington said. He looked at Emily. "Between the second and third pass, you came on the radio and you said, 'Washington, how's Torres doing?' And he stopped. I'd been in firefights before. I'd called for air support before. I had never had a pilot come on the radio and ask me by name about a specific casualty." He shook his head slowly. "I said he's going to make it. And you said, 'Good, stand by.' And then you went back in." Emily remembered this, differently than Washington remembered it. She remembered the radio management the way you parse transmissions when you're also flying an aircraft in compromised conditions. The instinct to file away names and positions and casualty status in the working memory alongside fuel state and weapons count and threat orientation. She had not known in the moment that it mattered. "It mattered," Washington said, as if reading her expression. "I don't know how to explain why, but having you know his name and ask about him like he was a person you were responsible for and not a casualty status update, it changed how I felt about what was happening. Like someone was actually there, not just an aircraft, a person." Emily looked at him. "He was your patient," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Of course I asked." Washington nodded. Something about that simple answer, "Of course I asked," seemed to carry more weight than a longer explanation would have. Because it wasn't heroic. It wasn't a statement about values or sacrifice or the obligations of military service. It was just the obvious thing. She had asked because asking was the obvious thing to do. And the obvious thing in that context had meant something enormous. Brooks looked at his watch, not urgently, just noting the time the way men with operational habits always note the time. "It's almost 11, he said. "Somewhere to be?" Emily asked. "We booked a lunch," he said. "Nearby, we'd like you to come, if you're willing." She looked at him. "All 23 of you," she said. "All 23, he confirmed. "Plus you, which makes 24. And the base commander is going to be upset about his ceremony schedule." "The base commander," Brooks said, "has been standing at the edge of this crowd for 40 minutes doing nothing. I think his schedule has adjusted." Emily almost smiled again, the same not quite smile as before, the one with too many things in it. "What about Mercer?" she said. Brooks looked at the young pilot. Mercer looked back. "That's up to Captain Hayes," Brooks said. She considered it. She thought about the laughter that had opened the morning. She thought about the certainty in it, the contempt, the specific injury of being judged on a surface without any consideration for what lay beneath it. She thought about whether she was the kind of person who held that kind of thing against someone once it had been corrected. She found somewhat to her own surprise that she was not. "You're welcome to come," she said to Mercer, "if you want to hear more about the A-10. Mercer's expression shifted into something that was genuinely grateful without being theatrical about it. "I'd like that," he said. "Then come," she said. She turned back to the pink Warthog. She stood in front of it for a long moment, looking at the nose art, the ridiculous cartoon, the specific shade of pink that her crew chief Torres had mixed himself, because he told her nobody had a color called combat pink in the standard inventory, and he had to improvise. She thought about Torres. She had not spoken to him in a year. He had sent her a card after the discharge, a simple card, no military formality, just his handwriting on a plain white card. "You were the best pilot I ever crewed for." End of argument. She had kept it in the drawer of her bedside table, and she had not thrown it away even during the periods when she was throwing away most of the things that reminded her of who she used to be. She was going to call him tonight. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say. She would figure it out. "One question," she said to Brooks without turning from the aircraft. "Yeah," he said. "How did it get here? The actual aircraft. How did this specific A-10 end up at this base with this paint?" Brooks was quiet for a moment. She turned. His expression had something new in it, not hesitation, something closer to the expression of a person who has been waiting for a specific question. That, he said, is a longer story. Tell me anyway. After the investigation closed, he said, the wreckage of your A-10 was assessed for salvage value. Most of it was a total loss. But the nose section was structurally intact. It had survived the ejection and the crash in better shape than expected because of how you managed the final seconds before impact. You aligned the aircraft before ejecting, which most pilots don't have enough altitude to do, and the nose section came down relatively clean. Emily hadn't known this. The nose section was recovered, Brooks continued. It went into storage. I found out about it about 18 months ago through a contact who was doing an inventory of salvage components. And he paused. I pulled in some favors, which is a significant understatement. I pulled in every favor I had ever been owed by anyone in any branch of the military and several people in civilian contracting. It took 11 months. Emily stared at him. The aircraft you're looking at, Brooks said, is not the original A-10. It's a different airframe, a retired aircraft that was already designated for static display. But the nose section, including the nose art, is from your aircraft, the original pink Warthog. He stopped. What's on that aircraft is real. The cartoon, the paint. That's what was on your plane when it went down. Emily turned back to the aircraft. The cartoon Warthog with its ridiculous expression looked back at her. She stood very still for a moment. The nose section survived, she said. Yes, it survived the crash. Yes. She thought about the last seconds before ejection. The alignment of the aircraft, the habit drilled into her through 1,000 simulations of using every available second to reduce the consequences of what was coming. She had not been thinking in those final seconds about what would survive. She had been thinking about angles and altitude and the physics of ejection. She had been doing her job, and the nose had survived because she had done her job. Torres mixed that paint himself, she said. I know, Brooks said. I talked to him. She turned sharply. You talked to Torres. About 8 months ago, Brooks said. I needed to know the exact color for the recreation. He spent 45 minutes on the phone describing the mixing ratio. He paused. He also said, and I am quoting directly, you better make sure she knows about this. Because if she finds out you did all this without telling her, she's going to be furious. And I have seen Captain Hayes furious, and it is not something you want directed at you. Emily absorbed this. Then she said, he's right. I know, Brooks said, which is why we told you. You told me after you unveiled it in front of 200 people. We told you the same day, Brooks said, which I maintain is technically within the boundaries of what Torres specified. She looked at him, he looked back. There was something in his expression that was very carefully and very professionally and entirely unsuccessfully trying not to be amused. Emily Hayes, who had not laughed freely in 3 years, who had spent 3 years in the company of the wrong version of her own story, who had driven to the ceremony, planning to stand at the edge of a crowd and leave before it got complicated. Emily Hayes looked at Sergeant Daniel Brooks and the 23 men behind him, and the pink Warthog in front of her, and the Arizona sun overhead, and the worn unit patch in her hand, and she did something that surprised everyone present. She laughed. Not the not quite smile, not the suppressed almost sound. A real laugh, short, genuine, caught her off guard as much as anyone, and gone almost immediately, but real. The kind of sound that happens when something lands in exactly the right spot without warning. The platoon reacted to it the way people react when they've been watching someone very carefully for a long time and have just seen something they had been hoping to see. Kowalski grinned. Washington exhaled. Martinez closed his eyes briefly and opened them. Okafor, who had been carrying a specific weight since he admitted to the transmission, let something in his shoulders release a fraction. Brooks did not smile, but his eyes did something that served the same purpose. Lunch, he said. Come on. Emily took one last look at the pink Warthog, at the nose that had survived, at the paint that Torres had mixed in a forward operating base on a cold morning as part of a $20 bet, at the cartoon that soldiers had seen coming through cloud cover and weather that no aircraft should have been in, and had understood in that moment that someone had refused to leave them. She turned away from it and walked with the 23 men she had once refused to leave. Part 4, What Lunch Looks Like After 3 Years of Silence. The restaurant Brooks had chosen was a 20-minute drive from Red Canyon Air Base, far enough from the flight line that you couldn't hear the engines, close enough that half the tables on any given weekday were occupied by people in uniform. It was the kind of place that had existed in one form or another in every military town Emily had ever been stationed near. Slightly too loud, slightly too bright, with menus that hadn't changed significantly in 15 years, and a staff that had learned through long practice that military groups needed large tables and reliable coffee and the particular kind of privacy that comes from being left alone without feeling abandoned. Brooks had reserved the back room. Emily understood why when she walked in and counted the chairs, 24 of them, arranged around 3 pushed-together tables in a configuration that allowed everyone to see everyone else, which she recognized as an instinct from men who had spent years in environments where having eyes on your people was not a preference but a requirement. She sat where Brooks indicated, which was at the center of the long side facing the door. She noted this without commenting on it. Old habits from both of them. Mercer had come. He sat near the end of the table, close enough to be part of the conversation, but with enough distance to signal that he understood his position. Here, invited guest, not equal member of the group, present on sufferance and grateful for it. He had left his flight suit colleagues at the base. This was, Emily thought, the right call. Some things needed to be experienced individually before they could be shared. It was 11:23 in the morning. The coffee arrived before anyone had opened a menu. Brooks wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at Emily across the table. "Can I ask you something I've been sitting on for 3 years?" he said. "You've been asking me things for the last 2 hours," she said. "This one is different," he said. "This one is personal." She set down her own mug. "Go ahead," she said. "When you were in the medical facility," Brooks said, "after the valley, when you woke up and asked if everyone made it out, and we told you, yes, what did you feel?" The table had gone quiet, not performatively. Naturally, the way a large group of people goes quiet when a question has enough weight to command silence on its own. Emily looked at the surface of her coffee for a moment. "Relief," she said. "That was the first thing, pure relief. Like something structural had been removed from my chest." "And after the relief," Brooks said. She was quiet for a moment longer. "Dread," she said. Nobody at the table moved. "Because I knew what the relief meant," she said. "I knew that if everyone was alive, the equation was going to balance out a specific way. The aircraft was gone, my leg was broken. I had no idea yet what my spine looked like. And the relief that everyone was alive meant that I had to confront the fact that I was the one who had taken the damage, that the mission had cost something, and that the something it had pawned was me." She picked up her coffee mug and held it without drinking. "That sounds selfish," she said. "I know it does. But that's what it was. The dread was not about my injuries. It was about what my injuries meant. It meant I was done. And I knew it immediately before any doctor told me, before any panel of officers sat across from me with career transition paperwork. I knew it the second I understood that everyone else had made it out intact." She paused. "Because I am a pilot. That is not a job I had. That is what I am. And losing it, even trading it for 23 lives, felt like losing a piece of myself that was never going to grow back." The table absorbed this. Kowalski, at the far end, had both hands flat on the table in front of him, and he was staring at them. "I didn't know it would feel like that," Emily said. "I want to be clear about that. I didn't make the choice in that valley knowing what it would cost me personally. I made the choice because it was the only choice available to the person I am. The cost came after. The cost was..." She stopped. "The cost was a surprise." "Does it still feel like a loss?" Martinez said. He was sitting across from her, 2 seats to the left of Brooks. He was turning his coffee mug slowly in his hands. 3 years later, "Does it still feel like that?" Emily considered the question the way she considered things she wanted to answer accurately. "It feels different this morning than it did 3 hours ago," she said, "which is not something I expected to be able to say today." Martinez nodded. He nodded like someone who has been carrying a question for a long time and has just received an answer that is not the one he expected, but is better than the one he feared. "I need to tell you something," he said. Danny Brooks said, a warning tone not harsh. "No," Martinez said. "It's relevant. It's something she should know." He looked at Brooks for a moment with the specific look of a younger soldier declining a senior's implicit instruction, which requires a certain kind of quiet courage in itself. Then he looked back at Emily. "When Sophia was born, my daughter, when she was born 2 years ago, I was in the delivery room. My wife Elena she's not sentimental exactly. She's very practical. She doesn't like a lot of emotion in the room when there's work to be done. But after Sophia came out, when everything was okay and everyone was counting fingers and toes, Elena looked at me and she said, "Call your mother," because she knew I was going to cry and she didn't want to be the one holding the phone. A few people at the table made sounds of recognition. "I didn't call my mother," Martinez said. I walked out into the hallway of the hospital and I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall and I thought about the valley. He stopped. "I think about it every time something major happens. Every time I cross one of those thresholds that only exist because I came home. Sophia's birth, my sister's wedding, which I got to be at, my dad's retirement party last spring. Every one of those things exists in a line that goes back to one night in Afghanistan." He looked at Emily directly. "I know you know that. Brooks told you. But I wanted to tell you myself. Not as an abstract thing. Sophia exists because you stayed." Emily set down her coffee mug very carefully. "Sophia," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Does she have your eyes or your wife's?" Emily said. Martinez blinked, surprised again. "Mine," he said. "Elena says it's unfair because mine are dark and she wanted blue eyes. And Sophia came out looking exactly like me, in miniature. And Elena says she did all the work and I got all the credit." Several people at the table laughed. Real, warm laughter, the kind that happens when a room full of people who have been sitting with something heavy find something light enough to breathe around. "Send me a photo sometime," Emily said, "if you're willing." Martinez looked at her like she had said something he hadn't prepared for. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I will." Okafor, who had been quiet since his admission on the runway, spoke from his end of the table. "There's a question I want to put to the room," he said. "If that's all right." Brooks gestured with his mug. "Go ahead." "We've been talking about what happened in the valley," Okafor said. "About what Captain Hayes did. About the kid," he paused. "What I want to ask is this. Not to her. To us. To the men in this room who were on the ground that night." He looked down the table. "How many of you have told anyone, not in general terms, not the military version, the after-action version, actually told someone what it was like? What you were thinking when you were in those rocks, waiting to find out if you were going to see tomorrow?" The table went quiet in a different way than before. This quiet had texture. "My wife," Washington said. He said it quietly. "Last year, we'd been married 4 years, and she knew something about the deployment had stayed with me. But I'd been managing it, I thought. And then one night she just looked at me and she said, 'Tell me what happened.' And I said, 'There's nothing to tell.' And she said, 'Daniel, tell me.' And I did." He paused. "It took 3 hours. She didn't say much. She just listened. And when I was done, she said, 'I'm glad you came home.' And I said, 'Me too.' And that was it. We just sat there for a while." "That's a good wife," Brooks said. "Yeah," Washington said. "She is." "I haven't told anyone," Kowalski said. His voice was matter-of-fact, not confessional, just accurate. "My dad would listen if I told him. He'd sit there and he'd take it in and he'd say, 'Okay,' and that would be that. But I haven't found I don't know, the right moment. Or maybe I've been waiting until I understood it better myself." "Do you understand it better now?" Mercer asked. Everyone looked at Mercer. He seemed aware that he had spoken into a conversation that was not primarily his and had the grace to look slightly uncertain about it. But Kowalski considered the question seriously. "A little," he said. "Coming here helped. Seeing the aircraft. Hearing Brooks tell the story out loud in front of people." He paused. "Hearing her talk about what it cost." He glanced at Emily. "No offense, ma'am." "None taken," Emily said. "It helped because," Kowalski stopped. Started again. "Because I've been thinking about what happened in the valley the same way for 3 years. And the way I've been thinking about it is that we got lucky, that an aircraft happened to show up, that the weather happened to allow it, that the variables happened to break our way." He looked at his hands. "What I understood today, hearing Brooks hearing you tell it, is that it wasn't luck. It was a choice. A specific person made a specific choice, and that changes it. It changes what it means." He paused. "Luck is just luck. You can't do anything with luck. But a choice, that's something you can carry differently." Emily looked at him for a long moment. He was 22 years old. He had been 19 in that valley. He had spent 3 years thinking the wrong thing about the right event. And now he was sitting at a table in a restaurant outside Red Canyon Air Force Base, reformulating it in real time, and doing it with a clarity that people twice his age often couldn't access. Kowalski, she said. Ma'am. You're going to be all right, she said. It was not a complex thing to say. It was not a profound thing. But the way she said it, the particular weight of a person who has been through her own version of not being all right and has arrived at a place where she could say the words with authority, it landed the way simple things land when they carry the right amount of truth. Kowalski nodded. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The food arrived somewhere around noon. The conversation shifted into the register that large groups of people shift into when the emotional altitude has been high and the body makes its practical demands known. People ordered. Coffee was refilled. Someone at the far end of the table told a story about a training exercise that had gone sideways in a way that was completely non-threatening and genuinely funny, and the table responded with the kind of laughter that means a room is breathing again. Mercer, Emily noticed, was listening to everything with the quality of attention she associated with people who have undergone a significant recalibration and are rebuilding from a new foundation. He ate carefully and spoke sparingly, and when he did speak, it was to ask questions rather than offer statements. This was not a natural mode for him. She could tell that from the effort visible in it, but he was doing it, which was better than not. Between the main course and the point where the table started to think about whether anyone wanted dessert, Brooks reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table in front of Emily. She looked at it without touching it. What is that? She said. The original recommendation, he said. The 3-page version. Before modification. Emily stared at the paper. I kept a copy, Brooks said, of what I actually wrote, before anyone changed anything. He paused. I want you to have it, not for any official purpose, not to reopen anything, just so there's a record, in your possession, of what someone who was on the ground that night believed was true about what you did. She touched the edge of the paper without unfolding it. You wrote 3 pages, she said. I write long, he said, clearly. Read it later, he said. Not here, when you're alone. She folded her hand around it and put it in the inside pocket of her service dress jacket. She felt it there, specific and real. 3 pages of what someone who was present believed was true. Brooks, she said, yeah. What made you come today, she said. What made you organize this specifically? The ceremony was publicly announced. I assume that's how you found out about it, but you didn't have to come. You didn't have to bring the men. You didn't have to recover the nose section or build the memorial or any of it. She paused. What was the moment that made you decide? Brooks was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, about 8 months ago, I was at a VA event in Albuquerque, talking to a group of guys from a different unit, different conflict, different circumstances. One of them was talking about a pilot who had supported his convoy in Iraq. He said, I never knew his name. I never got to say thank you. He said it like it was the one unfinished thing, the one thing that had been sitting wrong for 15 years. He paused. And I thought I know her name. I've known her name for 3 years. I've had her address for 2 years. I've had the ability to close that loop, and I've been waiting for the right moment, which is a way of not doing the thing. He looked at Emily directly. So I stopped waiting for the right moment, and I made one. The table was quiet. Then Washington said, That's the most words I've ever heard you say in a non-operational context. Brooks looked at him. I'm having a day, he said. The laughter that followed was genuine and easy and exactly what the moment needed. Emily laughed with it, the second time that day. Less surprised by it this time. Something was loosening in her that had been locked for a long time, and it was loosening not because of a single dramatic moment, but because of the accumulated weight of 23 people refusing to let her carry the wrong version of her own story alone for one more day. It was 12:47 in the afternoon. Outside the restaurant, the Arizona sun had moved to its high position, and the desert was doing what deserts do in October, producing a clarity of light that made everything visible at distance, every ridge and shadow and detail, as if the air itself had decided to remove all ambiguity. Emily was not thinking about that. She was thinking about the paper folded in her jacket pocket, about Torres and the phone call she was going to make tonight, about Sofia Martinez, 4 years old with her father's dark eyes existing in the world, because a woman on a runway at 0400 had looked at a weather report that said turn back and decided it was data rather than a command. She was thinking about Kowalski saying luck is just luck. You can't do anything with luck, but a choice is something you can carry differently. She was thinking that 3 years was a long time to carry the wrong version of a story. And she was thinking that tables like this one, loud and slightly too bright and full of people who had been through the same category of thing, were perhaps the specific environment in which the wrong version could finally be set down and replaced with something more accurate. Okafor, she said. He looked up from his food. The transmission, she said. What you told me on the fourth pass. He stilled. I want you to hear something, she said. And I want you to actually hear it, not just process it and file it away as something I said to make you feel better. Okay, he said. I was going back in regardless, she said. I have reviewed that decision from every angle available to me over 3 years. I have gone back through everything I knew at the moment of the fourth pass, my fuel state, my weapon state, the threat picture, the mortar position on the eastern approach that I had been tracking since the third pass. The sixth run was already determined before your transmission, not because of anything you said, because of what the situation required. She paused. You have been carrying something that doesn't belong to you. Okafor looked at her. He was a man who did not show things easily. 3 years in the army had given him a face that was capable of presenting one thing while another thing was occurring behind it. But right now at this table in this restaurant, something behind his face moved. I hear you, he said. Good, she said. He nodded. And the specific quality of that nod, the completeness of it, the sense of a thing being laid down rather than just acknowledged, told her that he had in fact heard. Mercer had been quiet for several minutes. He had finished eating and was holding his coffee mug with both hands in a way that reminded Emily unexpectedly of how Brooks had held his at the beginning of the meal. He was looking at the center of the table. Captain Hayes, he said. She looked at him. I'm going to go back to the base tonight, and I'm going to read everything I can find about the A-10, he said, and about that mission specifically. Whatever's in the public record. There isn't much in the public record, she said. I know, he said. That's part of what I want to understand better. He paused. But I also want to ask you something, and if it's not appropriate, tell me. Go ahead. Would you be willing, he said, at some point to come and talk to my squadron? Not officially, not as a guest lecturer or anything formal, just as someone who has been in a situation that most of us haven't been in and made a decision that most of us haven't had to make. And to talk about what that's like, what you actually think about, what it means. He stopped. I think we need to hear it. I think I needed to hear it today, and I can't be the only one. Emily looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 3 years she had spent not talking to anyone who was still in the Air Force. The careful distance she had maintained from the world she used to inhabit. The way she had structured her life around not having to be in rooms where she was the person who used to be a pilot. She thought about what Brooks had said, about stopping, waiting for the right moment, and making one. Give me your contact information, she said. I'll think about it. Mercer reached immediately for his phone. Emily watched him pull up his contact card and had the distinct impression that he was moving quickly before she could change her mind, which she found to her own surprise more endearing than irritating. She gave him her number. He looked at it on his screen like a man who has just been handed something he intends to take very good care of. Thank you, he said. Don't make me regret it, she said. I won't, he said, and then with a self-awareness that she hadn't fully credited him with. Before this morning, he added, I know I'm starting at a significant deficit credibility-wise. You're recovering, she said. He nodded. Brooks was watching this exchange with an expression that had relaxed considerably from the controlled intensity he had been carrying all morning. He looked, Emily thought, like a man who had organized an event and discovered that the event had become something larger and better than his organization accounted for, which was the best possible outcome for any operation, and he knew it. I want to say something, Brooks said, to the table, to all of them, to all of you. The table settled. 3 years ago, he said, I wrote 3 pages about a pilot who wouldn't leave us in a valley. The pages got modified. The record got trimmed down. And I've thought about that a lot, about what gets preserved and what gets lost when institutions process things. How the official version and the true version are not always the same version, he paused. Today, in front of however many people were on that runway and in front of whatever cameras were rolling, the true version got told. Not in a document, not in a record that can be modified. Out loud where people could hear it. He looked around the table. I want you to understand that what happened today is now part of something that doesn't get modified. It's in the memory of everyone who was on that runway. It's in Mercer's memory, which I think will matter to the people he flies with. It's in the memory of the journalists who were there. He stopped. The record that matters most doesn't live in any filing system. Nobody at the table spoke for a moment. Then Kowalski said, "Where does it live?" Brooks looked at him. "Here," he said. He touched his chest. Then he looked at Emily. "And here." The table went quiet in the way it had been quiet several times that morning. Not empty quiet, but full quiet. The kind that happens when a room has received something and needs a moment to hold it before moving on. Emily sat with it. She sat with the worn unit patch in the pocket of her jacket next to the 3 pages of what someone believed was true. She sat with her cane leaning against the chair beside her. She sat with her coffee going cold, and 23 men around her, and one young pilot at the end of the table, learning something he hadn't known he needed to learn. She sat with the new version of the story, not the version where she lost. The version where she made a choice, and the choice had a cost, and the cost was real and significant, and the equation balanced in a way she had not been able to see clearly from inside her own grief. She did not feel healed. She was realistic enough to know that was not how this worked. The leg was not going to repair itself. The career was not going to return. The 3 years of carrying the wrong version of the story were 3 years that had happened and did not unhappen. But she felt something that she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like the person she was and the person she had been were for the first time since the crash the same person. Not broken and whole, not past and present, the same person. The one who had looked at a weather report at 0400 and decided it was data rather than a command. The one who had asked about wounded soldiers between combat passes. The one who had aligned the aircraft before ejecting, because that was what you did when you still had a second left and there were things still worth doing with it. She was still that person. She was going to have to rebuild the rest of herself around that fact. It was going to take time. It was not going to be simple or clean or linear, but she had the right foundation now. And that she thought, looking around the table at 23 men who had driven through the night and flown in from Georgia and sat in a restaurant in Arizona to give it to her. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything. Part 5, the weight you carry home. The drive back to Tucson took Emily an hour and 40 minutes. She drove it alone, the way she had driven everything for 3 years. Windows up radio, off the silence of the car, a familiar container for whatever was happening inside her. Except this time the silence felt different, not empty, not the specific hollowness that had been her company for most of 3 years. It was the silence of a person who has said everything that needed saying and is now living in the aftermath of having said it. She stopped once at a gas station outside the city limits, not because she needed fuel, but because her hands needed something to do, and her leg was telling her that 3 hours of standing on Arizona asphalt had an opinion about the situation. She stood next to the car and stretched the leg carefully the way the physical therapist had shown her, and looked at the desert going orange in the early afternoon light, and thought about Martinez's daughter, Sophia, who had her father's dark eyes and existed in the world because of a choice made on a cold morning 3 years ago. She got back in the car. She drove the rest of the way without stopping. When she got home, she did not go inside immediately. She sat in the driveway with the engine off and took the 2 things out of her jacket pocket, the worn unit patch and the folded 3 pages, and held them in her lap. She looked at the patch first, turned it over, ran her thumb across the worn edge where the thread had gone soft from handling. She thought about Brooks carrying this for 3 years, not displaying it, not framing it, carrying it in his jacket, the way you carry something you intend to give to someone when the moment arrives. She thought about what it means to wait 3 years for a moment. She unfolded the 3 pages. She had promised herself she would read them alone, and she was alone, and the car was quiet, and the afternoon was going gold around her. So she read 3 pages in Brooks's handwriting, dense, precise, the handwriting of a man who had been taught to write reports in the Army and had never lost the habit of making every word carry weight. He had documented everything: the timeline, the threat assessments, the radio transmissions, the individual pass numbers, the weapons expenditure. The moment he saw the aircraft shudder on the 5th pass and the transmission he sent, in the 3 words he got back: "I'm still here." He had documented the 6 pass and the missile impact and the ejection and the recovery of the pilot and in what she said when she was conscious. He had documented all 23 soldiers by name and current status. He had written in the third paragraph of the second page a sentence that stopped her completely. It read, Captain Hayes operated not in violation of protocol, but in fulfillment of the deeper obligation that protocol exists to serve the preservation of human life at the cost of personal risk, and her decisions under fire demonstrated a quality of judgment that cannot be taught in any training environment and should be recognized as such. Emily read that sentence 3 times. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded the pages carefully, put them back in her pocket, picked up her cane, and went inside. She called Torres at 6 o'clock. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he had been expecting her call, which meant Brooks had told him about the ceremony, which meant the network of people paying quiet attention to her life was more organized than she had fully appreciated until now. Captain Hayes, he said, not ma'am, not Emily. Captain Hayes, 3 years out of the Air Force, and he still said it the same way he had said it on the flight line, on cold mornings when she was walking to her aircraft and he was handing her the maintenance clipboard. Torres, she said, you talked to Brooks. 8 months ago, he said. Yeah. You told him the paint mixing ratio. He needed it to be right, Torres said. It had to be the exact same color. I wasn't going to give him a close approximation. You spent 45 minutes on the phone describing paint ratios. 47, he said. I timed it. She breathed out. The nose section survived, she said. I know, he said. Brooks told me. He stopped. There was something in the stop that was unlike Torres, who was not a man given to stops. He was precise and fast, and when he had something to say, he said it. This stop had the quality of something that needed a moment to be correctly organized before delivery. I'm glad it survived, he said finally. I spent a lot of time on that paint. You spent $20 losing a bet, she said. I spent $20 winning the best story I've ever had, he said. There's a difference. Torres. Ma'am, did you know they were going to be there today? The platoon. Brooks told me about 3 weeks ago, Torres said. He didn't know if you were going to show up. He said you'd been invited, but he wasn't sure. He said another stop shorter this time. He said he was going to come regardless, that the aircraft deserved someone who knew it standing in front of it. Emily pressed her lips together. He came for the aircraft, as she said. He came for you, Torres said. The aircraft was the excuse. She didn't say anything. Captain Hayes, Torres said. His voice had shifted into something quieter, something that had more weight in it than his usual efficient delivery. I've wanted to say something to you for 3 years. I've drafted it probably a dozen times. Texts I didn't send, emails I wrote and deleted, cards I thought about and then sent a different card instead. The card you sent was fine, she said. I kept it. I know it was fine, he said, but fine wasn't what I wanted to say. A pause. What I wanted to say was that in 11 years of working on aircraft, I have crewed for a lot of pilots. Good ones, excellent ones, a few genuinely extraordinary ones. And you were, he stopped for the 3rd time, and this stop was different from the other 2. This one was a man arriving at something he had been building toward for a long time. You were the only pilot I ever worked with who knew every person on the ground by name before she started her engines. You used to ask me for the roster, the names of the soldiers in the supported unit, and you would memorize them on the taxi out. Emily sat very still. She had done this. She had forgotten that she had done this. It had been a habit so automatic that she had stopped consciously noting it years before the crash. Before every mission where she was providing close air support, she asked Torres for whatever names were available in the operations order. Ground unit commander, key personnel, anyone whose name she might need to use on the radio. She had never explained it to anyone. It had just been a thing she did. I didn't know you noticed that, she said. Captain Hayes, Torres said. I noticed everything about the way you flew. That was my job. But that specific thing, I noticed it because none of the other pilots did it. Not once, not one of them. He paused. I used to think about what it meant, about what kind of pilot memorizes the names of the people she's protecting before she takes off. And I decided it meant that for you, those people were never a mission. They were always people, from before you even left the ground. She was gripping the phone more tightly than necessary. You know what I think about now, Torres said. I think about the fact that on that runway in Afghanistan, you knew their names before you even had radio contact. Before Brooks called you in on the grid, You already knew their names. Emily thought about that. It was true. She had the names. She had memorized them on the taxi out the same way she always did. She had known Brooks's name before he introduced himself on the radio. She had known Okafor and Washington and Martinez and Kowalski before any of them said a word to her. They had been people to her before they were a situation. That's why you stayed, Torres said. Nit? It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. I know, he said. I always knew. They talked for another hour. Not about the mission mostly, about Torres's family, which had grown by one since the discharge, a son now 18 months old, named after Torres' grandfather. About the flight line at their old base, which had changed considerably. About the A-10 program, which was always being argued about in budget discussions, and always surviving those arguments, because there was always someone who had been on the ground when one showed up and understood what the aircraft meant in a way that no cost-benefit analysis could fully capture. About what she was doing now. She told him about the mentoring work, the young aviators she had been working with through a veterans program, teaching them things that didn't appear in any manual, how to think under pressure, how to prioritize when everything needed to be prioritized, how to hear the voices on the radio as people rather than data points. That's good, Torres said. That's what you should be doing. It doesn't feel like enough, she said, compared to flying, Torres said. Yes. Captain Hayes, he said, you know what the best aircraft I ever worked on was. Not in terms of specs, not in terms of capability, in terms of what it did. She waited. The one that came back to that valley 6 times, he said. That's the best aircraft I ever touched, not because of what it could do, because of what the person flying it decided to do. He paused. The aircraft is a machine. The decision was yours, and you're still making decisions. You're still in a cockpit, functionally. The young pilots you work with are the aircraft. You're still flying. She sat with that for a moment. That's a significant stretch of the metaphor, she said. I stand by it, Torres said. She almost smiled. She was doing that more today than she had done in 3 years, almost smiling. Almost arriving at the expression, fully finding it within reach in a way it had not been for a long time. Torres, she said, ma'am, thank you for the paint ratios. A beat. Thank you for taking the bet, he said. She hung up and sat in her kitchen for a while, not doing anything in particular, just occupying the space of her own house with a different quality than she usually occupied it. Something had shifted in the geometry of the place. Same walls, same furniture, same cane leaning against the counter. But she was sitting differently inside it. The next morning she woke up at 5:47, 17 minutes before her alarm. This was not unusual. Her body had kept military hours for so long that even 3 years of civilian life had not fully persuaded it that sleeping past 6 was acceptable. What was unusual was the quality of the waking. She came up out of sleep cleanly without the slow, reluctant resistance that had characterized most of her mornings for 3 years. Without the moment of lying still while the weight of the previous day resettled itself across her chest. She lay in the dark for a moment and thought about the pink Warthog. Not about the crash, not about the investigation, not about the gun. She thought about what it looked like with the morning sun on it. The specific shade of pink that Torres had mixed from available materials on a forward operating base because nobody had a color called combat pink in the standard inventory. The ridiculous cartoon with its determined expression that soldiers had seen coming through cloud cover when they were out of options and had understood in that moment that someone had refused to leave them. She thought about this plaque, courage that did not ask to be beautiful. She got up. It was the first morning in 3 years that she had gotten up before her alarm without the alarm, being the thing that forced her out of bed. She called Brooks at 8. He answered immediately, which suggested he had also been up for some time. You read the 3 pages, he said. Not a question. Last night, she said, in the car. Yeah. The sentence in the 2nd page, she said, about protocol. Which one? The one about the deeper obligation that protocol exists to serve. Yeah, he said. Did you write that before or after the modification? Before, he said. It was one of the lines that got removed. Of course it was, she said. Of course, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to do something. I need your help, and I need to know if you think it's the right thing before I decide to do it. Tell me, he said. Mercer asked me to come talk to his squadron, she said. About CAS, about decision-making under pressure, about what it takes and why the cost matters. She paused. I told him I'd think about it. Have you thought about it? Brooks said. I'm thinking about it right now, she said, out loud. To you. Okay, he said, keep going. I've spent 3 years not being in rooms with active duty Air Force, she said. Not because I was told to stay away, because I couldn't figure out how to be in those rooms as the person I am now instead of the person I was. Because every time I thought about it, the version of myself I was going to have to bring into that room was the broken version, the discharged version, the one who lost the aircraft. And now, Brooks said, now I have a different version, she said. Not a better version in every sense. The leg is still the same, the discharge is still the same, but the story inside the version is different. She paused. I think I can walk into that room with the right story now. Brooks was quiet for a moment. I think you should do it, he said. You think I should talk to a room full of F-35 pilots about close air support decisions? She said. I think you should talk to a room full of young people who are going to be in situations where they have to decide whether to stay or leave, he said, and who have not yet had anyone explain to them what staying actually costs and why the cost is worth it, and who are going to be better at their jobs, better at protecting the people on the ground who are counting on them if they hear it from someone who has lived it. He paused. The F-35 part is incidental. Emily sat with this. Kowalski said something yesterday, she said, about luck versus choice, about how luck is just luck, but a choice is something you can carry differently. I heard him say it, Brooks said. He's 22, she said. He was 19 in that valley, Brooks said. He's been thinking about this for 3 years. 22 is a long time to think about something that matters. She nodded, knowing he couldn't see it. I'm going to call Mercer, she said. Good, Brooks said. Brooks. Yeah. The 23 men, she said. All of them. Is there a way I don't need to see everyone again immediately? I understand people have lives and crews and kids and Colorado to get back to. But is there a way to, she stopped trying to find the right word for what she wanted. Stay connected, she said finally, to whatever this is, to not let it go back to being something that happened once and then dispersed. Brooks was quiet for a long moment. I'll set something up, he said. A group, something simple, so people can check in, so you can check in. Nothing complicated, she said. Nothing complicated, he confirmed. Just present the way you were present in that valley, still there. She breathed out. Still there, she said. She called Mercer at 9:15. He answered before the first ring had finished, which told her he had been hoping for this call with a specificity that he was not entirely managing to conceal. Captain Hayes, he said, I'll come talk to your squadron, she said. One condition. Name it, he said. No rank, not in the room. I'm not coming in as a former captain. I'm coming in as someone who has information they need. The moment it becomes a ceremonial event or a formal lecture or anything that puts me behind a podium with a placard in front of me, I'm leaving. Understood, he said. No ceremony, just conversation. And they can ask anything, she said. I'm not coming in with a prepared presentation and talking points. They ask, I answer. Real questions, real answers. They'll have real questions, Mercer said. Trust me, after what I've been telling them since yesterday. She paused. You've been talking about it, she said. I haven't been able to stop talking about it, he said. I got back to the base last night and my roommate, Lieutenant Chen, she's been flying for 2 years. She could tell something had happened. She asked me what was wrong. I said, nothing's wrong, something's right, which I've never said before in response to that question. And then I talked for 2 hours. He stopped. She cried, which I did not expect. She said she'd been thinking about something similar, about whether she'd have the same thing, whatever the thing is that you have. And I told her what you said about building yourself into the right person for the moment arrives, and she said that was the most useful piece of flying advice she'd received in 2 years of service. Emily absorbed this. When can I come, she said. They settled on a date 3 weeks out. Enough time for Mercer to organize it properly without making it into the kind of event she had specifically asked him not to make it into. Enough time for Emily to think about what she wanted to say, which she was already thinking about in the background, the way she had always thought about missions constantly in parallel with everything else, building the picture gradually until the moment of execution. She spent the 3 weeks doing what she had always done before something important. She got very quiet, not avoidant quiet, not the 3-year quiet of someone managing grief, working quiet, the quiet of a person who is preparing. She talked to veterans from other conflicts through the program she worked with, not about her mission, about theirs, about the moments they had carried and the stories they had built around those moments, and whether the stories they had built were accurate. She found more than once that the story people built around a hard experience was not always the most accurate story available. It was usually the story that the person's grief required at the time, which was not the same thing. She was learning to ask the questions that help people find the more accurate version. She thought about Brooks and 23 men driving through the night to give her a different version of her own story, and she understood that she was now doing something structurally similar in a different context with different people, taking something that had been given to her and figuring out how to pass it forward. 2 days before the visit to Mercer's squadron, she received a package in the mail. She recognized the return address, Albuquerque, New Mexico. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a photograph printed on good paper and protected in a small frame. A little girl no more than 4 years old standing on what appeared to be a back porch in afternoon light. Dark eyes, her father's eyes exactly. An expression of absolute focused attention on something outside the frame of the photo, something the camera couldn't see. A note in Martinez's handwriting was tucked behind the frame. It said, "This is Sophia. She wanted to know who the picture was going to. I told her it was going to someone important." She said, "Okay." Then she went back to looking at whatever she was looking at. She does that, gets completely absorbed by things. Elena says she gets it from me. I say she gets it from somewhere better than me. On the back of the note in smaller handwriting, "Thank you for every day she has." Emily set the photograph on the mantel above the fireplace. She stood in front of it for a while. Then she went to her desk and wrote Martinez a letter, an actual letter on paper, the way people used to communicate when they wanted something to last. She told him that Sophia was going to grow up knowing that her father was the kind of man who drove 12 hours to tell a pilot she hadn't lost. She told him that was the kind of thing children remember even when they don't know the specific story behind it. She told him that whatever Sophia grew up to be, she was going to grow up understanding that people show up for each other, that they drive through the night, that they tell the true version of things out loud where people can hear it. She mailed it the next morning. The day she went to Mercer's squadron, she drove herself. The base was different from Red Canyon, newer, more technologically oriented, the specific aesthetic of facilities built around fifth-generation aircraft rather than the older, more industrial character of A-10 bases. She noticed this without judgment. Different tools for different jobs. The world needed both. Mercer met her at the gate. He looked nervous in the way that people who are not often nervous look when they are slightly more precise than usual, slightly more controlled, the control itself giving away the nervousness underneath. "How many?" she said. 42, he said. The whole squadron was available. Some of them have heard parts of the story. Some of them have heard all of it. All of them want to hear you say it yourself. She nodded. They walked to the room together. It was a standard briefing room, the kind she had spent hundreds of hours in over her career. Chairs arranged facing a front wall. A screen. She told Mercer. Immediately she was not going to use a podium. She told him to move aside. She stood in the front of the room with her cane and looked at 42 pilots. They ranged from 23 to their mid-30s. Men and women, all of them looking at her with the specific quality of attention that people give to someone they have already decided is worth listening to before the person has said a word. This was Mercer's work. Whatever he had told them in the days before her arrival had prepared the room in the best possible way. She didn't do preamble. She never had. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "that nobody told me before my first real CAS mission. And I wish someone had." The room went completely still. "The people on the ground," she said, "are going to sound like voices on a radio. That's unavoidable. That's the medium. But they are not voices on a radio. They are people with names and children and specific things they want to do tomorrow, if tomorrow is available to them. Your job, your actual job, the job underneath all the doctrine and the ROE and the systems and the procedures, your job is to make tomorrow available to them." She paused. "And there are going to be moments when doing that job requires you to make a decision that lives outside the approved parameters, not in violation of the spirit of those parameters, in fulfillment of it." She told them about the valley. Not the way Brooks had told it at the ceremony, not from the outside looking up, from the inside, from the cockpit, from the weather report at 0400 and the decision to taxi out anyway. From what she had heard on the radio between passes and why it mattered that she had known their names and why she had always made a point of knowing their names. She told them about the sixth pass and the calculations she made in the final seconds before it. She told them about the missile and the ejection in the 11 hours she was unconscious and what she had asked when she came to. She told them about the 3 years that followed and what she had been carrying and what had happened on an Arizona runway when 23 men decided she had been carrying the wrong version long enough. She told them about Kowalski saying, luck is just luck, but a choice is something you can carry differently. She told them about Torres and the paint ratios and the $20 bet and what it means when a pilot paints a cartoon on a combat aircraft and then flies it into conditions that no aircraft should have been in and comes out the other side in a way that lets a child named Sophia exist in the world with her father's dark eyes. She talked for 2 hours. The room did not move. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to have weight, and then a young pilot in the second row. She looked about 24 with the focused expression of someone who has been holding a question for the entire duration of a presentation and is now deciding whether to ask it, raised her hand. Lieutenant Chen, Mercer said quietly beside Emily. She was the one who cried. Emily nodded. Go ahead, Lieutenant, she said. You said you couldn't leave, Chen said, that it was something you were incapable of. That's how you described it. Not that you chose to stay, that you couldn't leave. She paused. What does that feel like from the inside, that specific kind of incapability? Emily looked at her. It feels like clarity, she said. All the noise goes away, all the parameters and the calculations and the threat assessments. They're still there, you're still running them, but they shift into the background. And what's left in the foreground is very simple. People are down there, they need you. You're still capable. You stay. She paused. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like the only obvious thing. Chen nodded slowly. How do you build that? She said. How do you get to a place where the obvious thing is to stay? Emily thought about what she had said to Mercer on the runway, about making the hard choice every time there's a hard choice, starting with the small ones. You practice being a person who stays, she said, in every small situation where leaving is easier. You practice it so many times that when the large situation arrives, staying is already who you are. It's already your default. The situation doesn't create the person. The person was already there. The situation just reveals them. Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to be that person. I know, Emily said. That's why you're asking. After the session, Mercer walked her back to her car. The afternoon had gone long and the base was in its end-of-day rhythm personnel, moving with purpose between facilities. The sound of aircraft engines somewhere in the distance. How did that feel? Mercer said. Like the right thing, she said. Will you come back? She looked at him. He had changed in 3 weeks. Not dramatically, but the change was visible in the way he held himself, in the quality of his attention, in the specific absence of the easy contemptuous certainty she had seen in him on the runway. Yes, she said. I'll come back. He nodded. Thank you, he said, for coming today, for not, he stopped, for not holding what I did on the runway against me. You didn't know, she said. Now you do. That's what knowing is for. I extended his hand. She shook it. And then she drove home back through the desert afternoon with Sophia's photograph waiting on the mantel and Torres's card in the bedside drawer, and Brooks's 3 pages in her jacket pocket, and the worn unit patch she had not put it away, had not framed it or stored it, was carrying it the way Brooks had carried it in her jacket close, and the particular knowledge of a person who has recently discovered that the story they were living inside was not the most accurate story available. She had traded an aircraft for 23 lives. She had spent 3 years counting only the aircraft. Now she was counting the lives. And the number was different. The number was Sophia Martinez, 4 years old, looking at something outside the frame of a photograph with the focused attention of someone who has her whole life still to look at. The number was Kowalski 22, finally understanding the difference between luck and choice. The number was Chen 24, deciding she wanted to be the kind of person who stays. The number was Mercer changed. The number was 23 men who drove through the night because somebody asked them to, And because they had been waiting 3 years for a moment that mattered. The number was everything. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then she got out of the car, took her cane, walked to her front door, and went inside. Captain Emily Hayes, who had once been the pilot, everyone forgot, was not forgotten. She had been carried home by the people she saved, and she had finally, after 3 years of counting the wrong things, allowed herself to be counted.